so I'm going to talk about Bernie's socialism versus Nixon's liberalism. So Bernie, no middle name Sanders, socialism, and Richard Milhouse, Nixon's liberalism. Okay, so there's some important distinctions, right? Nixon's a liberal and Bernie's a socialist. You're comparing them. Is there even any comparison? There's a lot of important differences. So the war on drugs. Nixon started the war on drugs in 1971. Bernie Sanders is opposed to Nixon's 1971 war on drugs. Now, when Nixon started it, some people say he's liberal because 2/3 of the money that was spent on the war on drugs was spent on treatment. And then no Democrat or Republican president has matched that level of funding for treatment on the war on drugs ever since. I think it's just probably a ploy to get the liberals on board with the war on drugs because he had a liberal Congress. So some people said that he had a liberal Congress, that he was a conservative, but he had to do what the liberals in Congress wanted him to do, so his hands were tied. I remember seeing a 1970s newspaper clipping where a man had been sentenced to 100 years in prison in the 1970s for a little small baggie of marijuana. 100 years for a small possession charge? It's insane. So Bernie and Nixon are the opposite when it comes to authoritarian, totalitarian fascism. Bernie Sanders believes in an end to war, imperialism war, all the 27 wars. He wants to hold the police accountable. So he's opposed to authoritarianism. The thought that he could ever become a Stalin is absolutely crazy. He could become a Eugene Debs. Now, if he becomes a Eugene Debs, oh my God, you know, that would be wonderful. But he's most likely an FDR, a New Deal Democrat. So Bernie Sanders, you know, he doesn't believe in war. Nixon escalated Vietnam, said he was going to get us out, kept it going. He wanted to hang on to South Vietnam as long as possible because he felt that as soon as the American troops withdrew out of Vietnam, Saigon would fall. South Vietnam, the whole government we propped up would fall because without American arms, there really wasn't much of a military or a nation or anything. It's almost like we invaded Vietnam and then propped up a puppet government. So by withdrawing, the puppet government would, you know, just fall. So Nixon was slow at bringing Vietnam troops home because he didn't want the fallout, the political fallout of Saigon falling. So he wanted to hang on to the war for as long as possible until after 1972. Then when South Vietnam collapsed, it wouldn't affect his re-election campaign. So he waited, and he waited. And then he promised in 1972 to get out of Vietnam. So Nixon, you know, wasn't really against the war. He said that he was, but he really wanted to. So, you know, Bernie and Nixon are the opposite when it comes to authoritarianism, when it comes to the war on drugs, when it comes to imperialism in general. Nixon was the law and order president because those damn 60s kids were fucking everything up, right? All those 60s of free love, sexual revolution, women, you know, showing their hind ends, just dancing with, you know, showing their hiney all over the place. And so, law and order. So he ran under as a law and order president, which, you know, Donald had copied. So it's very weird that he'd be a liberal, right? So Bernie and Nixon are opposites when it comes to authoritarian, totalitarian fascism. I want to make a quick side note. In 1972, Richard Milhouse Nixon is going to meet up with Mao Zedong, who is the leader of the People's Republic of China. He killed 100 million Chinese people. But Nixon is going to be called a genius for normalizing relations with China. He met up with Mao. He's called a genius for doing this. And since the formations of the People's Republic in 1949, the U.S. didn't recognize Beijing or China. And so from 49 to 72, that's what, 23 years. For 23 years, the U.S. pretended that who was running China really wasn't running China, and then maybe one day Taiwan might, you know, come back. So Nixon was visiting a nation that he, as national U.S. policy, pretended didn't even exist. And yet when Tulsi Gabbard meets with Assad or Mahdi or El-Sisi of Egypt, she's called a traitor. When Mao killed millions, millions upon millions. Assad, I don't even know what the body count for Assad would be, but it's not even 1 million. FDR allied with Stalin in the fight against Hitler. Stalin killed more than Hitler did, 40 million. Mao's 100 million. Hitler, by comparison, killed 10 million. And then people are going to, you know, get on Tulsi because she is offering a peaceful diplomatic channel to these dictators. So if our, aggression doesn't work, then perhaps peace could. Maybe we should try peace first and then end with aggression. We should exhaust all peaceful options and then try, violence. Noam Chomsky says Nixon is in many respects the last liberal president America has had. So again, he's Mr. Law and Order, Mr. Vietnam War escalating it, Mr. War on drugs. He ran a campaign towards the silent majority of conservatives who were frightened of the 1960s, and then the Democrats picked stupid-ass Hubert Humphrey in 1968, right? Martin Luther King, shot, killed. RFK, shot, killed. Just 3 years ago, Malcolm X, shot, killed. And now, in 1968, we don't get RFK, right? We're not getting any. We got Hubert Humphrey, okay? Well, shit, I might have voted for Nixon over Humphrey, too. Talk about a weenie of a man. Nixon accused Alger Hiss of being a Soviet spy. So his, conservative credentials, they're pretty entrenched. So evil, wicked, disgraced Richard Milhouse Nixon, being a liberal may be shocking to some. Some claim that Nixon was a conservative. He just had to do the liberal shit because he had a liberal Congress. Democrats in Nixon's Congress organized bills without consulting the White House, and Nixon's Congress is very independent. Who cares what was in Nixon's heart? Just look at the effects of his actions. So let's look at Nixon's record, okay? So Bernie Sanders is going to agree with Richard Milhouse Nixon's all these policies, okay? I'm about to list a bunch of policies right in order, and I'm going to talk about a few of them, okay? So Nixon, the last liberal president we had. Jimmy Carter didn't fire a shot, so when it comes to imperialism, he was pretty liberal, but he was going to decriminalize marijuana and do this and do that, and that never came to pass. So Clinton, they passed welfare reform, they passed a crime bill, they passed NAFTA, all this right-wing shit. So who was the last liberal? I think Nixon might have been the last liberal president America has had. So let's take a look at, all the things that Nixon did. So Nixon is going to establish the EPA. The EPA was actually established by executive order. So he crammed the EPA down the throats of Congress. He foisted the EPA upon Congress in the United States. The EPA. The Republicans hate the EPA. They want to wipe out the EPA. They put all these, oil company executives in charge of the EPA today. But it was started by a Republican. It was started by Nixon. So Nixon is going to establish the Environmental Protection Agency. He's going to pass OSHA, which is Workplace Safety Rules. It's the Occupational and Safety Hazards Act. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA. So it's just, the workplace should be safe, and there's rules for the workplace that says you must be safe. So the OSHA Act of 1970, the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act of 1972, the Clean Water Act of 1972. He's going to extend the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He's going to pass WIC, the Supplemental Nutritional Program for Women, Infants, and Children, increase funding in the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Affirmative action is going to be its most quota-oriented form. During Nixon's reign, he normalized relations with China, even meeting with, an evil dictator such as Mao Zedong. He believed in détente with the Soviet Union, including nuclear arms agreement like SALT, the Strategic Arms Limiting Talks, nuclear arms agreements, strategic arms limitation talks. So you had Reagan, you had Nixon, who was, doing these nuclear arm agreements, and now Trump is getting out of all these arms agreements. So, this is a Republican who loves clean air and clean water, cares about the environment, has a Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act of 1972, cares about workplace safety rules, passes OSHA, is going to give free food and nutritional, additional nutritional stuff for women and their children with WIC. WIC is very popular. So WIC. This is Nixon. Nixon passed WIC. Okay? Clean Water Act, EPA, OSHA, WIC. He's going to enforce affirmative action in its most quota-oriented form. So when affirmative action was at its, worst, it wasn't fair, right? The quota thing. Nixon was doing that. Then you had aid for education, including Title IX in 1972. He expanded Social Security and he expanded unemployment benefits. And Eisenhower is going to do this. Eisenhower expanded Social Security. Eisenhower expanded unemployment benefits. Nixon does the same thing. Nixon's expanded Social Security included supplemental security income plus a cost of living adjustment for those already on Social Security. He is for urban aid, for highway construction and mass transit subsidies, and he is for food stamps. Now, Nixon did have, one conservative thing. He appointed some conservative Supreme Court justices. And they're saying in the long term, the changes that did, that just was so much. And that could be true. I mean, I'm not sure who he named to the court, but it'd be interesting to see, how much different, So he's just for food stamps. He's in favor of food stamps. He's in favor of WIC. He's in favor of education, Social Security, unemployment benefits for urban aid, highway construction, mass transit subsidies. He's not going to be a communist. The worst he could be is a Eugene Debs, Bernie Sanders is. And so people are going to get mad about Bernie Sanders because he's what? In favor of all the same things, for a welfare state, just like Nixon was in favor of. Money for education, money for Social Security, money for the unemployed, money for highway construction, mass transit, money for food stamps and WIC. And then he's going to extend the Voting Rights Act, the Clean Water Act, Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act, 72, both were done in 72, Clean Air Act of 1970 passed OSHA, and then he established the EPA. So he does all this stuff with the environment. He's funding all these programs, even the arts and the humanities. And then he's not a liberal. I mean, this is all this stuff. Bernie Sanders agrees with all this. OSHA, EPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Federal, environmental, the voting rights, WIC, all this. But Donald Trump is cutting food stamps. Donald Trump is racist. He's not going to be for affirmative action. He might be for reverse affirmative action. Aid for education, Social Security, they're talking about cutting all this stuff, so cutting programs to make sure the 1% get a nice little tax cut for Christmas. So the only thing that Bernie Sanders would not agree with Nixon on is basically a communist, a right-wing Politburo communist, a centralized controlled economy. So Nixon is going to pass price and wage controls. So in 1970, he passes an executive order, executes it August 1971, and the price and wage controls said that for the next 3 months, America, for 90 days, he imposed a freeze on wages and prices in order to counter inflation. Nobody could raise prices, nobody could raise wages, so he's fighting against capitalism. And after 90 days, price and wage increases would have been approved by a pay board and a price commission. This is a centralized controlled economy. You can't pay your workers what you want to pay. They can't negotiate for higher wages, prices. Nothing could go up. Nothing could go up unless the pay board and price commission approved of it. So this is for, 90 days. There was a freeze. I don't know how this thing turned out. I think it failed, and that's a great thing because not even Bernie Sanders would control the economy to this extent. A centralized, controlled economy sitting there saying, all prices are hereby frozen. All prices in America for 3 months. No more, increase of prices. That's incredible. So Nixon is a goddamn Stalinist. He's not just communist, he's a Mao Zedong Stalinist. I mean, maybe that's, why he went and met with Mao Zedong. So for price and wage controls, Nixon is actually to the left of Bernie Sanders. Nixon is all, full-blown communist, centralized controlled economy, Politburo, Castroite. He is the biggest communist in the world when it comes to price and wage controls, and Bernie Sanders is not in favor of that. So when we compare Bernie's socialism with Nixon's liberalism, Bernie is clearly to the left of Nixon. But Nixon's had a lot of liberal planks. Nixon had a ton of liberal planks, and Bernie would agree with all those liberal planks, and then Nixon would be more of a liberal today than he would be a conservative, because those things are not what the Republicans stand for today. So Bernie Sanders, he believes in more welfare state than what Nixon does. Nixon believed in some welfare state, food stamps, education, WIC, a whole bunch of stuff, right? So he believes, Bernie believes in universal health care and college and child care, and he also believes in a federal jobs program. So this is a lot bigger of a welfare state. So Bernie's to the left of Nixon on a welfare state, but they're both in favor of, public spending. Nixon believed in food stamps, funding food stamps in public schools, highway, mass transit, arts and humanities, WIC, a nutritional program for women, infants, and children. He believed in funding for all those things. So does Bernie Sanders. Nixon also believed in affirmative action in its most quota-oriented form, which is the opposite of Trump. And Bernie Sanders opposes reparations, so he might even be opposed to affirmative action. You need some corrective mechanism, but for how long? And it isn't fair if somebody that was less qualified got a job. If you're both qualified, I feel like who's more qualified? Somebody's going to be more qualified than the other, and then you pick the one who's most qualified. Period. Now, there was affirmative action. You know, you had to hire, you had to at least take in applications and reach out to different groups. So affirmative action, I mean, right after, you know, the 60s, so I think reparations would be way better. Pass reparations once, and then now we're all on the same page, right there. Now we've repaired the damage. A generation that did not impose slavery just paid for a generation that never even endured an ounce of slavery, but we paid it. Reparations is here, and so affirmative action, how long? Till how long does affirmative action go to? So Nixon was in favor of affirmative action, and for race relations, he's better than Bernie. So, you know, for affirmative action, he's, you know, about the quotas. Now, quota system, it's not really fair, right? If you want to be honest, it's not fair. It's just not fair. Unless you think white people aren't people and you're a racist piece of shit and you think that the way to beat the racism of white supremacy is just more racism for all white people no matter who they are. Unless you're that kind of person. A quota system is not fair at all. Now, Bernie Sanders, right, he agrees with the food stamps, public school funding, highway, mass transit, arts and humanities, WIC. He agrees with all those programs. He also approves of the environmental laws of Nixon's, the Pesticide Control Act 1972, Clean Water Act 1970, Clean Air Act of 1972, and then the EPA. The EPA was formed by executive order. So Nixon forced the EPA down our throats. And OSHA, which is Workplace Safety Standards. But Bernie Sanders is opposed to universal basic income. No reparations, no universal basic income. Both Nixon and Bernie Sanders agree on no to reparations, but Nixon agrees with the UBI. At least he tried it. I believe it was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Nixon is going to send Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld to do this universal basic income experiment, and then it didn't go as well as he wanted to, and then they shut it down. Then he was totally opposed to it. But in 1969, Donald Nixon, Donald Jefferson Nixon, Richard Milhouse Nixon, he proposed a welfare program where there was a minimum income, $1,600 per year for a family of four, which is equivalent to $10,000 today, or with the dollar of 2016, would be paid out to poor families. It would be paid out to poor families. And so you have Andrew Yang, who is today saying $12,000 a year. So $1,600 a year is the same, essentially, as Andrew Yang's program. So Nixon instituted Andrew Yang's UBI program. And, it didn't work out. Then he was going to turn against it. But he introduced it. Under Bernie Sanders, there's no chance of him getting universal basic income. There's no chance that he'll be a Stalinist either. At the most, he'll be a Eugene Debsist. He'll just go to as far left as Eugene Debs and go as far right as, FDR. But that's amazing. So there's three major issues on affirmative action. Nixon is to the left of Bernie. On the universal basic income, Nixon is to the left of Bernie. And then also, what was the other one? Not the EPA, but he did seem to love the EPA way more. And then there was another thing the price and wage controls. He's so far left, it's not even funny. He's a damn Stalinist when it comes to the price and wage controls. So, the EPA, I want to just talk about a little bit about the EPA. So, the EPA, he's going to pass it by executive order. Not a single vote of Congress approved the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, Nixon may have passed the EPA to stop all the different environmental legislation that was being thrown at him. Nixon proposed the EPA July 1970, signed the executive order December 2nd, 1970. Later on, so about 5 months later. So December 2nd, 1970 is when the EPA is going to be established. And they established the administrator, Ruckelshaus. So Ruckelshaus was confirmed by the Senate to be the administrator for this brand new department called the Environmental Protection Agency. The executive order is going to be ratified. I'm not for sure if it's ratified by the houses, but there were committee hearings in both houses, and both of the committee hearings had approved of it. but the House and Senate did not come right out and ratify it. So the EPA is just, by executive order, just here because the president said, you know, do this. I order this to be done. Congress didn't do shit. I'm not even for sure if Congress has completely ratified them. There was some, you know, the committee hearings on it, so they said, okay, it's fine what he's doing. So they weren't going to stop him from doing it, but that's not necessarily saying, okay, you know, let's ratify this thing into law. So that's amazing. That's incredible. So the Republicans that were opposed to the EPA, well, they could just say that it was unconstitutional. It's never been voted on because Nixon did it, though. It's a Republican, so they can't make that argument, right? Because that's going to make Nixon look bad. So when it comes to the EPA, he passed the EPA by executive order. He passed the EPA by executive order. He's to the left of Bernie on affirmative action, to the left of Bernie on universal basic income, and he's to the left of Bernie on price and wage controls, which I'm okay with that. I don't want Bernie doing price and wage controls. So he says, you know, no to UBI, no to reparations. Bernie does, but Bernie isn't to the, you know, Bernie is not way, but he's to the left of Nixon. So Nixon isn't going to do much for unions. He's not for instant runoff voting either. So both Bernie and Nixon agree on instant runoff voting, but they disagree on unions. Bernie Sanders actually just said that he's going to abolish all the so-called right to work states. So he's going to pass the, you know, ban the idea that you could break a contract between a union and their employer. If we believe in contracts and a group of people get a contract with their employer, we should honor that contract. But for some reason, these, you know, so-called right-to-work states are just trying to bust unions up. So it's just a bullshit, you know, bullshit thing. It's not, oh, I deserve a right to work. I want a right to work. It's a right to bust unions. You can work, right? You can work wherever you want to work. So anyways, Bernie Sanders is to the left of Nixon, except for a few things. So, yeah. When it comes to Bernie Sanders' socialism and Richard Milhous Nixon's liberalism, Nixon's liberalism is shocking, it's surprising, but it doesn't go as far as I would like for it to go. There's public spending, there's environmental protections, there's workplace safety standards, there's WIC, you know, a lot of good things. It's the affirmative action, so he's doing things for race, you know, to combat racism. But Nixon is, you know, to the right of Bernie. Bernie is to the left of Nixon, and for most everything, right? So, compare and contrast, I'm not for sure. I feel like I want to say Nixon is 50% of a Bernie Sanders, or maybe 75%, probably 50%. Nixon is a liberal, but he's not a socialist. So, Nixon is like 50% of what Bernie Sanders is. So, he's to the right of, Nixon is to the right of Donald Trump, but he's to the left of Bernie Sanders. And Bernie is to the right of Eugene Debs, but he's to the left of FDR. So there you go. There's Bernie's socialism versus Nixon's liberalism.